Welcome to my patron post this week. We have finished week 24 of our trek through the book of Acts, and we've looked at Acts 17. In Acts 17, Paul and Silas found the churches at Thessalonica and at Berea, and then Paul goes down to Athens, where there are at least a few Christians, people who believe in Jesus there. But Paul ends up having to have a little arraignment maybe before Mars Hill, the Areopagus, where Paul is, it's being considered whether Paul is in trouble or not, I think. I think that's the way to take it against the background context. We know that there are some Stoics and Epicureans among the crowd there. Epicureans, of course, had their one of the dominating philosophies of the day. The Roman version of it, eat, drink, be merry, tomorrow we die. That's not the Greek version, but that's the kind of the pop version, which pretty much sums up American culture, right? Let's party, we just want to have fun. That's the pleasure phase of life that Kierkegaard talked about. But Stoics were a little slightly different, and I wanted to talk about Stoicism in the New Testament because I think it's a very interesting subject myself and possibly relevant. So who were these Stoics? Of course, the word Stoic has come into English language. If somebody is very stoic, they don't smile a lot. They're not very emotional. They're very disciplined. They don't talk maybe that much. They measure their words. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we say when we say somebody is stoic. We think of Spock or something like that. But of course, things change meaning over time. I'm not sure if that's where I really want to start with the ancient Stoics. Probably we should never start with what a word means today when we're trying to figure out what something meant, in the past, because meanings change. But who were the Stoics? So the Stoic school was founded by a guy named Zeno in the early 300s before Christ. Zeno came to Athens about 313 BC. For a while he studied apparently with the Cynics, although later Stoics weren't that keen to make that connection. Some denied it, in fact. It's exactly what we would expect. So the Cynics were another group that kind of basically believe that all rules are made up by people. Who says you can't pee in public? The Cynics, the word cynic comes from the word for dog in Greek. But anyway, let's just pass on there. The name Stoic comes from the place where they met. And so the Zeno taught in the Stoa Poikiles, I think. And so eventually they came to be known as the Stoics because that's where they taught. So the Stoics started in the early 300s. After Zeno died in the 200s, there were two other kind of founding leaders of the Stoic school. There was a guy named Cleanthes who followed Zeno, and then after Cleanthes, Chrysippus followed him. Cleanthes, interesting, wrote a hymn to Zeus that was so widely circulated that we have it even today. The interesting thing about this hymn to Zeus is that if you were to take the word Zeus out and put God, we actually might find most of the hymn pretty agreeable. We could make it a Christian hymn, or the Jews could make it a Jewish hymn. Maybe even the Muslims could make it into a Muslim hymn because it talks about the one God, I believe. So the hymn to Zeus isn't too bad. But of course, we would rather refer to God as God or Yahweh. But so these are the first three main founders of Stoicism: Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus. It was modified a little bit later, what we call the Middle Stoa, but these three were the main formulators of what became Stoicism. Another famous poet is Aratus. Every educated person in the Roman world knew some of Aratus. He was a poet, and Paul quotes him in Acts chapter 17. We are his offspring. I'll mention that again later on in the video. I should add that I have a number of books on Stoicism. In fact, one of them I should have pointed out is over here on my shelf somewhere. Can he find it? 3, 2, 1. Okay, here's a classic book on the Stoics by F.H. Sandbach. So there's a book on the Stoics that's an oldie but a goodie. I don't know. I'm trying to remember when this book came out. It's been out a very long time, 1975. Well, that's a long time, right? Also, here's another book by Troels Enberg Peterson, Paul and the Stoics. Thought maybe I would mention that. But for quick reference this morning, I largely went to Everett Ferguson's Backgrounds of Early Christianity. This is just a nice little book that you might want to read through at one point if you want to go on to do further studies in biblical studies. He has a nice section on the Stoics, very clear. Okay, so I've used that extensively in making these PowerPoints. Okay, so there were three main branches of philosophy for the ancients, ancient Greeks, let me say. Physics, which had to do with the material, the nature of the material world. Logic, which had to do with how do we know that we know what we think we know, what we call epistemology. And then third was ethics. And by far, ethics was the most important piece. So even though I'm starting with physics and logic, the ethical piece was the most important part of Stoic philosophy and of Epicurean philosophy, I would say as well. Okay, so this is kind of hard to believe, but there's some good insights in this. The Stoics were materialists. That is, they believed that everything was material. This idea that, and they believed in spirit, though. This is the thing. When the ancients talked about the soul, or when the ancients talked about the spirit, they were talking about something that was material for them. And so this whole divide between natural, supernatural, material, and immaterial, that has a lot to do with René Descartes in the late 1500s. So when the Stoics believed, for example, that there is a spirit, they believed it was material. It was just thin material. So there are two kinds of material for the early Stoics. There's this kind of material that's pretty dense, I can't walk through walls. But then there was also spirit matter, as it were. That sounds ridiculous. Isn't that a contradiction? Spirit matter. To remember that for these people, the spirit was a material substance. It was just thin, a thin material kind of substance. Now, the Stoics believed that spirit was in everything. So you might call them pantheists. A pantheist is somebody who believes that everything is God. And so, indeed, the Stoics believed that everything has God inside of it. That's how what's the quote from Aratus? We are God's offspring. What is he saying? He's basically saying that we all have God within us. And for him, that's the spirit that's in everything. You can call it the logos. Hey, ever heard that word before? Fire. So the Stoics drew a lot on a guy named Heraclitus, who believed that the fundamental substance of everything is fire. So they connected fire with spirit, which reminds me of some of the statements in the New Testament. I think of Hebrews 1:7, is it? God makes his angels a flame of fire. Interesting. Maybe just a superficial parallel. We have to be careful about parallels like that we don't see more connection that's actually there. That's called parallelomania. But the Stoics called it Zeus. So the Stoics did not believe that Zeus was a literal being. But you could call the God inside of all of us Zeus, or Providence, because they believed that everything was fated. And so part of what this spirit did was it led the world in a certain direction. And of course, the Stoics believed in general that direction was very positive, that things were getting better and better because of the logos working its way through reality. They believed the human soul had 8 parts, 5 senses, our voice, our generative power, and the mind that was the ruling principle behind everything, the ruling mind. What is the menos or something like that? Menos mind, dianoia. This reminds me of Philo's sense of a human person a little bit as well. Philo, it's almost like he has two hats, a Stoic hat and a Plato hat, and sometimes he has them both on at the same time. More on that in a second. Originally, the early Stoics believed that the world would be destroyed by fire, and then it would be regenerated, which is interesting. It reminds me of 2 Peter. It talks about the elements dissolving with a fervent heat and the world being destroyed by fire. This sounds Stoic. Now, whether there is a problem, though, with saying that 2 Peter is Stoic, because under the middle Stoa, say under Panaetius and Posidonius, these are people that lived in the late 100s BC, and in fact in the 1st century BC. The idea of a conflagration just did not really fit with a Roman audience. And so Panaetius changed Stoic doctrine from that conflagration to the world being eternal. If it's getting better and better, why would it have to be destroyed by fire, eh? And so probably there weren't a lot of Stoics at the time of 2 Peter who were arguing for world conflagration. Okay, what was the logic or the epistemology of the Stoics? Well, the early Stoics especially thought that emotion was bad. The goal was apatheia. This is where we get the word apathy, by the way. But the idea of apatheia was not, I don't care. You know, a lot of times when we say someone's apathetic, we almost imply that they have a negative opinion towards something. Apatheia for the Stoics meant complete disinterestedness. I'm about to die. That must be what is supposed to happen. You know, so apatheia means you don't care about you don't get emotional over what's going to happen. And so the Stoics definitely believed in kind of purging your emotions, getting rid of your emotions. I put this here, it doesn't necessarily belong here, but I wanted to mention that the Stoics were especially leaders in what we might call allegorical interpretation of the Greek myths. As I said, the Stoics didn't literally believe that Zeus or Athena existed, but they did not take Homer literally. However, they believed that there were allegorical principles to be derived from the Greek myths and Greek stories. Now, Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher of the 1st century AD, Philo was somewhat unique in that he both followed the literal interpretation of the Old Testament and the allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament. There were some Jews before Philo who merely interpreted the Old Testament allegorically. Philo both took the Old Testament literally and allegorically, and he got that allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament was probably a Stoic influence on Jews at Alexandria in the centuries before Christ. Okay, ethics, the most important part of the Stoic system. So, as it were, the world, not just humans, but the world had spirit. Everything had spirit. Trees have spirit, the plants have spirit, the sun has spirit. Everything is not just heavy material, but everything is also this lighter spiritual material, which means that there is logos, capital L, that permeates the entire world. The entire cosmos is permeated by logos, by fire, by spirit. And so there is a reason, that's another translation of logos, that permeates the world. And because we as human beings, we human beings are both heavy material and spirit as well. So we have the logos seed, we have the seed of the logos inside of us. There's the big logos of the accumulation of all the logos, and then there's the seed of the logos that's inside me. And so the goal of the virtuous person is to live in accordance with the logos inside of you. You have a seed inside of you. Live in accordance with that seed. Listen to the logos seed, the implanted word. Live in accordance with nature, as they might say. Now, they did believe that some things are neither good or bad. I don't know if you've ever heard of the adiaphora, but often in Christianity, we will talk about things that are not a matter of right or wrong. like whether or not I get the red Jello or the blue Jello. It doesn't matter. I don't know if I've ever seen blue Jello, but that's not important right now. And so there are an awful lot of issues where there's Christian freedom. It doesn't matter whether you get the red car or the gray car, at least not on the basis of their color. And so that idea of adiaphora actually comes from the Stoics, that there are many things that are indifferent when it comes to morality. The overall path is determined. So the Stoics believed that the future was fated. The future was determined. But that's the final trajectory. We can resist in the short run. This is why, well, if we're fated, how can you resist your fate? Well, you can resist your fate because even though the final destination is fated, you can fight it. But the Stoics would say that's silly. Why would you fight your fate? Because it's going to happen anyway. And so a wise person loves their fate. Love of fate, amor fati, and doesn't fight against it. Now, Philo, I mentioned Philo. Philo is what we might call a middle Platonist. Philo is a mixture of Stoicism and Platonism that took place, 100 years or so, in the 100 years before Philo. Why do I say this? Because there are at least superficial parallels between some of Philo's thought and the New Testament. In fact, I wrote a book, since I'm getting books. I wrote a book once upon a time, A Brief Guide to Philo. And there's a chapter in here on Philo in the New Testament, which you're welcome to disagree with. But basically, I think that Philo was in the water. Not only that, but Apollos was Alexandria. Listen to my train of thought. Apollos grew up at Alexandria. Philo was a major player in Alexandria. I have to believe that Philo played a major role in the great synagogue of Alexandria, which means that Apollos inevitably would have known a little bit of Philo and his thinking. I have to believe that. I don't think that's a ridiculous thought at all. In fact, I think that it's far more likely that Apollos was influenced by Philo at Alexandria than that he wasn't. And we know Apollos plants, he comes behind Paul at Corinth, right? So you have this guy potentially very influenced by Philo, who is having a major impact on the church at Corinth. And Paul, as you know, has to step in because of the divisions that happen between those who follow Paul and those who follow Apollos. And so you know that Paul's going to become better acquainted with what Apollos thinks. Now, I don't want to take this too far, but I just want to say that the idea that there might be some linguistic artifacts of Philo or even some possible thought categories from Philo in the church at Ephesus. I mean, Apollos was at Ephesus. Well, of course, that's quite possible in my mind. So this makes Philo an intriguing person to study in relation to the New Testament and Paul's letters. Okay, so here's how Philo and the Middle Platonists before him cooked Stoicism and Platonism together. So for Philo, the Logos is the image of God. Doesn't Colossians say that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation? Because I seem to remember Philo calling the Logos the firstborn of all creation. He does. Philo calls the Logos the firstborn, God's firstborn. So the Logos is the image of God. The Logos is both the plan for the world and the very mechanism of creation. So you see how God said, "Let there be light." So the word of God is used in creation, an instrument. The Logos thus stands in between God, who is the supreme pattern, the Logos, which is the copy of God, and yet the Logos is the pattern for the world, and then the world is a copy of a copy. The idea of pattern and copy comes from Plato, but the Logos is inserted as the kind of the thoughts of God. Philo can refer to the Logos, believe it or not, as a second God. Although most of the time, Philo, when he talks about the Logos, is probably just talking about God's reason, the reasoning of God, the personification of God's reason. Interestingly enough, Philo makes into so there's man is created in Genesis 1:26, and Adam is created in Genesis 2:4. Philo sees two creations here. The man created in Genesis 1:27 is the ideal man, the Platonic archetype man. And then in Genesis 2:4, the earthly shaped man, the man of clay, the shadow man, as it were, is created. Interesting stuff. Okay, so what about the New Testament? After all, this is the only reason I'm making this video is because potential parallels with the New Testament. First of all, Logos is in the New Testament. In the beginning was the Logos was with God, the Logos was God. I don't think Philo or any Jew would have had any problem with that statement. The interesting part is, of course, is John 1:14. The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. Because John is saying that in Jesus, the very reason and purpose and meaning of the universe became flesh. And we beheld his glory, as of the glory of the only begotten of the Father. There is through language in the New Testament that sounds very much like Logos language. Greg Sterling wrote an article called, I think it was Greg Sterling. He's certainly written on it. But somebody wrote an article called Prepositional Metaphysics, that there was a metaphysics of the prepositions like through that were used in Jewish literature before Christ. Notice these, that Jesus is the one through whom all things. Hebrews 1:2, through whom Jesus, through whom also God made the worlds. And the Colossian hymn, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Through him and for him all things have been created. The Logos was the instrument through which God created the worlds. So it's at least possible that in some of this language in the New Testament, we have an echo of the Logos. And of course, Jesus is compared, therefore, to the Logos. James 1:21, receive the implanted Logos, which is able to save your souls. Again, I don't want to suggest that James has a thorough investment in Stoic philosophy. That's not what I'm getting at. But there seems to be an echo here, maybe, of Stoic philosophy. It doesn't have to be a close in its meaning. But what would the meaning be? Well, the meaning would be that God has implanted within you this seed of the truth, and that you need to follow that seed. Other parallels, and I'm not going to go that much further. I mentioned, I think, in one of my videos that Philippians 4:11 sounds very Stoic. I've learned in whatever circumstances I'm in to be content. I both know how to be humbled, and to abound. This idea that I can be content under any circumstances is clearly similar to what the Stoics believed in terms of loving your fate. Then lastly, let me mention again that quote from Acts 17:28, where Paul quotes the Stoic poet Aratus, we are his offspring. Well, this has been a little background in Stoicism and some possible places where Stoicism may have directly or more likely indirectly at least impacted the language of the New Testament. It's always possible that there's a little bit more here as well. Well, thank you very much, and onward to Acts chapter 18.